Salutations to the Truth Core, whoever and wherever you may be on the planet. This is yours truthfully, John Lash, once again, with a message coming at you through my YouTube channel. As you can see, I've started a series on the channel, Mythology 101, and I do intend to continue and complete that series. At the same time, I'm uploading what I call more or less random talks. I would probably list them in a playlist at some point. Let's see what I would call it. Oh yes, how about senile ramblings? And what do I intend in these spontaneous and random messages that I'm sending your way? Well, I'm taking the liberty to do something I've not done before. Just sit in the corner of the studio here and tell you what's on my mind from one day to the next, on the far chance that it might be relevant to you. So, the talks coming out in this sequence can be defined as, hold on, 6-syllable word, extemporaneous. And I don't know at any moment what's coming next, but what's coming right now is a few words on sexual enlightenment. Obviously, a huge topic and quite a troubling one. I'll try to keep my initial message under half an hour or 20 minutes or so, if possible. First of all, let me say that sexual enlightenment is exactly what we don't have in our society in the 21st century, obviously. And you could say that we in the Western world have perhaps never had it, and it's something we hugely need for the sanity of the species. So this talk will be in two parts. First of all, I'm going to give you an idealistic projection of what sexual enlightenment looks like. And then I'll go into the more gruesome particulars of the time we live in and the sexual wasteland we face today. There is a tradition that has existed all around the world, in every culture of the world, among indigenous peoples. And that is the tradition of what a mythologist or anthropologist or ethnologist calls rites of passage. So were we living in a sane world where communities of people looked after their progeny in the correct way, there would be rites of passage. And these would be of several kinds. One of them, of course, would be the rites of passage of puberty. And I'm going to tell you now what that would look like. What I'm going to say, you could consider as purely idealistic. You might even dismiss it as a fantasy of mine. But I'll leave you to decide for yourself the validity of this scenario. Ideally, the rites of passage of puberty would look like this. In the first place, young girls would initiate each other. And in the second place, young men would be initiated by older women. So I'm talking here about rites of sexual initiation. I would say it's a general rule in life that things that get off to a bad start are not going to develop very well. And I can certainly assure you, by reference of my own sexual experiences as a teenager, the first of which was at the age of 17, I believe, that's exactly what happened. It was not fun, and it was an experience that I really needed, but in the way it came to me, I didn't need it in that way. So I suffered from the lack of guidance. I suffered as a teenager from the lack of sexual enlightenment. Now, looking closely at these two cases, young men and young women who come into puberty and the hormones kick in. And one thing you need to know about the hormones and adolescent sexuality is that it is a wild, uncontrollable, demonic force. I use the word demonic, D-A-E-M-O-N-I-C. I use that word to distinguish, of course, from the word demonic, which is a corrupted and misleading term. A daemon is actually a spirit or power that fills someone with a force greater than they can personally contain. So you see someone who plays music and sings and does it well with passion is possessed by a demonic force. All teenagers are possessed by the demonic force of sexuality, by the hormonal rush. In considering these two cases, let's take the case of the young boys first. A young boy, when he comes into the need to experience sex, and I'm talking about heterosexual sex and only that, needs to be guided, and he needs to have the opportunity from the very first instance to be shown what to do. And who's going to show him that? Well, in my utopian vision, if you want to call it that, it would be an older woman. And she, of course, would have to have the qualifications to be a guide and teacher of sexual enlightenment to a young boy. So it goes without saying that that woman would have to be sane, clean, honest, and confident in her own sexuality. But given that were the case, the young boy would go to that woman and he would be able to have his first experience safely. I hate to use that word, you know why. With the COVID insanity rampaging on the planet, the words safe and safety have become corrupt. They have become weaponized tools for the enemies of life. But certainly, a young man needs to feel safe. There has to be a bond of trust and respect between him and the older woman who initiates him. And what does she do? Well, she tells him how to behave. She teaches him what I call, and I find this to be a delightful term, sexual manners. You know, manners are important in life. Table manners, manners in a social setting, manners at school. And there is such a thing as good sexual manners. So she would show him how the woman's body is designed, what the woman likes, and she would show him and guide him in how to please a woman and please himself at the same time. And if that initiation is successful, then he would go forth into his relationships with girls of his own age in his peer group with a much better attitude and a much greater assurance of happiness and success and good choices in his sexual relationships. What then about young girls? Well, ideally, the rite of passage for young girls needs to be conducted by the girls themselves. So in this scenario, I'm proposing young girls would get together in their teens, and they would, first of all, look at each other's bodies, and they would discuss what they feel, their erogenous zones. They would talk about how they feel about their bodies. They would talk about shame. They would talk about shamelessness. They would talk about what they want from their bodies. They would learn to trust their own bodies in the way that the young boy learns to trust his body through the initiation of the older woman, but they would do it among themselves. There actually does exist in ancient culture, at least one that I know of, and I'm sure it was more than one, an example or precedent for this kind of initiation among girls. It so happens that in ancient Greek culture, young women would initiate themselves in groups, and one of the key events, the key action in this ritual of initiation, a rite of passage into sexuality, involved the deflowering of the girl. So what these young women would do in this ancient culture, as I say, I have specifically Greece in mind, but I'm sure it existed elsewhere. But you find the evidence of it in Greek culture, in Greek sexual mores. I'm talking about the pagan world. You can count on that. They would use a stone implement, and that was called a herma, H-E-R-M-A, from the word Hermes. And it was in the form, yes, of a stone dildo. And it was associated with Hermes, the god Hermes, who was considered to be, among other things, the god of boundaries. So obviously the hymen of a young girl is a boundary. And when that hymen is penetrated, a boundary has been crossed and she has been initiated into sexuality. It would be a good practice today, in the interest of sexual enlightenment, if young girls performed this initiation together in a trusted band, and if they did it themselves. In fact, I would say it's imperative that they do it themselves. The word hermetic comes from the Greek Hermes, the name of that god. So what is hermetically sealed? Well, a woman's sexual organs are hermetically sealed. Now, sometimes that seal, the hymen, can be broken by accident. but it would be better if it was intentionally broken by the girl herself with a supportive group around her. So what the young girls used to do in Greek times was just that. And they would sit on the herma for that purpose. Now, this act of initiation is tremendously important in the sexual life of a young woman. It is, in fact, an act of empowerment. And the message contained in this act is that her pleasure is her own to decide. And when she knows that, when she is confident in that determination that her pleasure is her own to decide, well, then she goes into the encounters with young men with a sovereign attitude toward her own sexuality. I'll tell you something about teenage girls. They are completely out of control. Now, typically, back in my day, for instance, you heard stories about the back seat of a car. So teenagers would go out joyriding, and eventually the boy and the girl would end up in the back seat of the car. Now, suppose this is the first time that the girl has experienced necking, as we used to call it quaintly. Necking, touching, kissing, French kissing, all of those things. The first time she has made herself available for a sexual encounter, well, it's completely off the charts. She has never before been stimulated by a boy, never before had parts of her body, such as her nipples, stimulated. And that sensation, that first sensation, is already off the charts. It's something that she can't control. And unfortunately, any boy, even the most or the worst specimens, will produce in her the same exquisite and uncontrollable sensations. And this is not a good thing. So in the group initiation of young girls, without going to lesbianism, because it has nothing to do with that, they would learn the erogenous zones of their own body, and they would stimulate each other or stimulate themselves so that they became confident with the overpowering sensations that arise in a sexual encounter. Then, when they turn to the world and have that encounter with a boy, they are no longer vulnerable to be overpowered by that first encounter or any other following encounter. You see? Now, I could say quite a bit more about my particularly idiosyncratic scenario of sexual initiations, but I'll let that go for now and move on to the present moment. Anybody who looks at the sexual wasteland today must look at it with a certain despair. I can guarantee you that whatever age you are, from 17 to 70, it's really, really difficult to find any kind of compatible and secure, trustworthy, and respectful sexual encounter. And that is not your fault, and it's not my fault. It happens to be the fault of those in our midst who want to see the true innocence and ingenuous sexuality of the Rome, the races, who want to see it degraded and degenerated. And those are the agents who are behind pornography, which, by the way, is another subject closely related to this one, of course. One thing you can say about pornography, however, is that there's a lot of pornography, and most of it is vile and disgusting. I could describe it as, at best, beautiful actions, beautiful and natural actions portrayed in an ugly way. But it's not entirely the case. You know, there are some rare clips of pornography, and this includes amateur porn, which simply show the natural act of sexual congress between male and female, and they show it in a respectful and loving way. What young people really need is sexography, not pornography. They need to be shown how to perform the sexual act. It's good for them to know the variations of it, but it's not good for them to learn those variations from porn. Bear with me. I'm rushing ahead here to complete this talk in under 30 minutes. So let me get to the main points of, what shall I say, advice. And you might wonder, on what authority I could give anyone advice on sexuality. Well, I won't go into the gruesome details or the inventory, but I will say this. I'm a veteran of the generation of the 60s, and there were two leading motifs of my generation. One was the psychedelic movement, and the other was the sexual revolution. So let me tell you, and I assure you, you're not going to hear this from anybody else in the world. The pure truth of what the sexual revolution was about, apart from all of the corruption around it. Basically, as a teenager, I just wanted two things. The expression free love, which was current at that time, meant two things to me, for what it's worth, to me as an individual. It may have meant promiscuity and orgies to other people of my generation. I don't know. I guess it did to some. I never went into that sandbox. So what did free love mean to me in my late teens and my early 20s? It meant, quite simply, the experience of sexuality didn't mean love. It meant the experience of sexuality that was free of two conditions. One condition was it was free of the risk of conception. In other words, I wanted the opportunity to have sexual encounters without the threat of conception, which would then be a binding situation that would impact my entire life. Second, I wanted to be free to experiment with more than one partner. Do not equate that with promiscuity. I was never promiscuous, but I was polyamorous. You see, one of the problems with sexuality today is that it tends to be interpreted between two extremes. One is monogamy, and the other is promiscuity. But did you ever hear anyone talk about polyamory? Polyamory is a careful selection of a limited number of sexual partners. So I wanted to be polyamorous because I wanted to play around and find out what I actually liked and who suited me, the girl that suited me, the girl that I could suit and match and please. Polyamory is the natural hunger of the human animal. Now, it's true, there are some cases in life, and I have seen them, where monogamy works, but they are extremely rare. So, polyamory is a criterion for sexual enlightenment. To be genuinely and wisely polyamorous, you have to have the ability to select, to be discriminating and discerning in your sexual partners. So that standard brings me to the final 2 points that I want to make in this short talk. First of all, it's my pleasure to inform you that sexual intercourse is an intimate act, but it is not a binding act. It may lead to bonding, and it may not, but in its essential nature, it is not a binding act. So no one is obligated to bind or bond with someone else simply due to the act of sexual intercourse. And when you know that it is an intimate act, but not an intimate bond, then you know something really, really important. And on the basis of that knowledge, you can learn how to handle it appropriately. You can learn how to handle sexual encounters appropriately. Final point I want to make is that everyone who takes this subject seriously needs to read the manual. And what's the manual? Well, I haven't written my version of the manual yet. So in the meantime, I refer you to a book by Wilhelm Reich called The Function of the Orgasm. That's the manual. And something that Reich said, which he uniquely said, is perhaps the best conclusion I can make to this talk. Reich said that a healthy sexual life is the basis of the self-governing character structure. That means that in society, in a community, the requirement for the individuals of that community to be self-governing, to be sovereign members of the community, is a good sexual life. By that I mean a sane and honest, respectful, balanced sexual life. So Reich taught that the sexuality of a person determines their character. And I stand strongly by that proposition. So I'll leave you with those matters to contemplate. Enough said. And I'll be seeing you in the beauty to come.